So welcome everybody to this research seminar with Martin O'Neill. Once young and promising, now an established scholar. He's going to talk about limiting markets, socialization, decommodification, and the sense of justice. And Martin is a professor of political philosophy at the University of York. That's Old York, not New York. And he was actually, before that, he was, I think you moved from the Department of Politics before you went into philosophy. So you were actually you were a reasonable politics guy, and then you went into philosophy, and as Bo will tell you, that will make you not as good as you could have been. You did your PhD at Harvard, not that long time ago, I think, because I'm older than you, 2008, with Scanlon, T.M. Scanlon and Derek Parfit, Freedom, Fairness and Responsibility. And you've written extensively, and I recommend lots of this to read, in social justice, liberty, equality, and in sections of political philosophy and public policy. And some recent publication is Social Justice and Economic Systems on Rawls Democratic Socialism and Alternatives to Capitalism. And you have written, which is very interesting from the Swedish point of view, you've been starting writing about the wager earner funds by Rudolf Meidner, and that might perhaps come up today. And then, of course, you've also been very interested in property owning democracy, Rawls, and similar things. So you're very welcome. Looking forward.
Thank you very much indeed, Gustav. And it's a lovely pleasure to be back at the Institute and to be back in Stockholm. I'd never been to Stockholm until a year ago last month, and no, this month last year. And now it's lovely to be back just a year on from that. So
we fixed the snow this time.
Yeah, it feels much more the kind of authentic weather experience that one might have imagined Stockholm being like at this time of year. So I won't, for anyone who is hoping to hear anything about Rudolf Meidner, he won't get an appearance this time, but lovely to be presenting here with my co-author Marcus Furendal in the audience, who I've written about Meidner with. This talk today, it's really going to connect to one of the papers that Gustav mentioned on social justice and economic systems, and it's part of what I think of as this kind of left Rawlsian project of trying to bring Rawlsian liberal egalitarianism and some form of democratic socialism into a happier and more productive mutual relationship. So what I'm going to do today, that's the structure of my talk. I'm going to talk about decommodification and social provision. I'll say a little bit about some of the slightly surprising aspects of Rawls's view on public provision and what the public sector would look like in a Rawlsian society. I'll talk a little bit about how Nordic social democrats have thought about public provision and the purposes of public provision and decommodification. Then I'll talk a little bit about what an alternative Rawlsian view might look like, taking seriously some of the things that Rawls talks about with the idea of the sense of justice, and making some use there of some of the work of the late Waheed Hussain. And then I'll give some thoughts about what liberal egalitarians should maybe learn from social democrats and democratic socialists, and finish up talking about what a kind of version of Rawlsian egalitarianism with a more expansive public realm would look like, and talk a little bit, especially about the relationship between where this kind of left Rawlsian view ends up and the view of Rawls and Miliband. So that's what I'll be covering today. So the question that I'm interested in is really what should be socialised in a just society? What reasons do we have to take goods out of market provision and instead to provide them through some form of collective public provision? So my hypothesis is that the liberal egalitarian approach to these issues has really inherited too much of really a kind of economistic framework from the literature in economics on the justification of for public sector provision. And I think Rawls is probably the primary vector for this excessive influence of what I think of as a kind of very economistic sort of framing. So my suggestion today is that we should step back from seeing market provision as the default, with departures from markets as needing some kind of special justification. And in this talk, I'll be arguing for a shift in perspective that puts collective public provision...
So a quick question of clarification. When you talk about markets, do you talk about capitalist market or some other kind of markets?
Markets in general, so that all will become clear, but it's a worry also about forms of market socialism. Yeah. So I'm interested in trying to nudge us towards a shift in perspective that puts collective public provision more at the centre of our socioeconomic model. I'll also suggest that there's a compelling justificatory route from within Rawls's own thinking towards a form of radical social democracy or democratic socialism or whatever exactly it might be, going via his concern with nourishing the sense of justice. Okay, so here's what Rawls says about public provision and public goods. So, forgive me, there's a couple of slides here where it's just going through the content of what Rawls himself has to say here. So he says, to begin with, it's helpful to distinguish between two aspects of the public sector. Otherwise, the difference between a private property economy and socialism is left unclear. The first aspect has to do with the ownership of the means of production. The classical distinction is that the size of the public sector under socialism, as measured by the fraction of total output produced by state-owned firms and managed either by state officials or by workers' councils, is much larger. In a private property, in a private property economy, the number of publicly owned firms is presumably small, and in any event limited to special cases such as public utilities and transportation. A second quite different feature of the public sector is the proportion of total social resources devoted to public goods. The distinction between public and private goods raises a number of intricate points, but the main idea is that a public good has two characteristic features, and here we have the canonical economist's account of public goods, indivisibility and publicness. So after a discussion of the nature of public goods and the problem of economic externalities, Rawls continues this way. He says, a final point about public goods. Since the proportion of social resources devoted to their production is distinct from the question of public ownership of the means of production, there's no necessary connection between the two. A private property economy may allocate a large fraction of national income to these purposes, a socialist society a small one, and vice versa. So for Rawls, on Rawls's view, a regime is socialist when the public sector dominates in terms of size, whereas in a capitalist system, the private sector is much larger. As Rawls sets things out, setting aside questions of socialism versus capitalism, there's a separate question of the level of provision of public goods, viewed in economic terms as goods marked by indivisibility and non-excludability. So, given all that, what does the non-market sector look like in a Rawlsian Just Society? So the picture that Rawls seems to have in mind seems to hold, to answer Gustav's question, for both a private property economy or for a market socialist economy. So when Rawls says in Justice as Fairness that he's agnostic between a property-owning democracy, so a highly egalitarian private property economy, or a form of liberal socialism, nevertheless, both of those are going to be societies where the division between market and non-market sectors is going to be pretty similar. So the idea is that most provision is through the market, but with the following kinds of exceptions. So A, genuinely public goods in the technical sense, so goods that really are public and indivisible, national defence, environmental regulation, and so on. B, Rawls talks about special cases such as utilities and transportation, so goods where infrastructure costs and so on make market mechanisms unfeasible, where there's going to be large efficiency gains through public provision. And I take it that, even on views like Dworkin's or Van Parijs's or, on any kind of plausible kind of liberal egalitarian view, these sorts of cases are going to be ones where public provision will make sense just on efficiency grounds. Rawls develops his view about healthcare, so it wasn't at all clear in Justice in A Theory of Justice, but by justice as fairness, after responding to the work of Norman Daniels, Rawls is much clearer that a system of socialised healthcare would be an element of a just society. Although here it looks like access to healthcare could still be consistent with some kind of voucher system, whether it's fully public provision or not is not terribly clear. And the provision of education and training, although again Rawls is surprisingly unclear here, perhaps it's only up to secondary level. And even here, Rawls isn't clear on the question of public versus private provision. So in A Theory of Justice, Rawls talks about the school system, whether public or private, should be designed to even out class barriers. So vouchers would seem to be fine on that view too. These wouldn't necessarily be public institutions, at least.
Is that your view or Rawls' view?
Rawls' view.
Oh.
Yeah. So, what would the Rawlsian public sector not do? Or what are some of the things that it wouldn't do? So, on the view in A Theory of Justice, and note, again, preempting, imagining what Gustav was about to ask me, note that this holds for liberal market socialism as much as for private property economy. There wouldn't be minimum wage legislation. Rawls is against that. Perhaps there'd be no state funding of universities, the arts, museums, etc. There's no discussion in the kind of Rawlsian set of works on public housing or preschool childcare or lifelong learning or lots of other things that we might think there's good reason to provide through the public sector. But no, nevertheless, in The Theory of Justice, there is space made for funding of universities, the arts, and so on. And there, he says, only as promoting directly or indirectly the social conditions that secure the equal liberties, and as advancing in an appropriate way the long-term interests of the least advantaged. So he doesn't really spell out what that argument might look like, but there is a bit where, as it were, having defended what looks like quite an austere account of what would be subject to public provision, it looks like there's some rowing back there. One complication of that is that the view that gets advanced in political liberalism replaces the Keynesian demand management of what Rawls calls the stabilization branch in A Theory of Justice, replaced by his endorsement in political liberalism of the idea of the state as employer of last resort, which is obviously a much stronger view and carries with it implications about what those jobs are going to look like, right, if there's a guarantee of state employment. Also in political liberalism, the very demanding unanimity of the exchange, of what Rawls calls the exchange branch. So this is a sort of an additional branch of legislative discussion where things that the state might do that aren't mandated by justice can be decided upon, but with a very demanding, in the original form, a very demanding requirement of unanimity in terms of an overall system of public expenditure. It's replaced by, I mean, very reasonably, given that that was a rather implausible aspect of the earlier view, it's replaced by an idea of ordinary legislation where society debates, for example, establishing national parks and preserving wilderness areas and animal and plant species, laying aside funds for museums and the arts. So this thought in the more austere earlier view that there's all sorts of things that current states do that we might think are very valuable that get ruled out within the Rawlsian account. He kind of rose back on that by the time of political liberalism, where that gets allowed back in. But it's hard to find a fully stable view across Rawls's different texts here. So the accounts of the institutions of a just society that you get in Theory of Justice, the accounts of the branches of government, are conspicuous by their absence in later works. And so it's surprisingly unclear what Rawlsian public sector institutions would actually look like under either property-owning democracy or liberal socialism. So this is really striking, right? So the most influential accounts of social justice of the last 50 years one that's, sort of set so many debates going, so many accounts of, thinking about distributive principles, is just incredibly radically underdefined, underdeveloped in terms of its institutional implications in either its private property or socialist.
Should we wait for questions? You can take question of clarification. Sorry, I should have. Can I have a question of clarification? I need a microphone if you want to have a quick question.
Yes, a question of clarification. You seem to make a very distinct division between market provision and public provision. But there are three things that can be either public or private. It can be finance, regulation, and provision. Mm-hmm. Now, if you take this in a 2x2, you have actually 8 different variations here. So for me, it's not so clear what is actually market or state. So you can, for example, have, like in Sweden, private schools, but all the regulation and all the funding is public. Mm-hmm. So if Rawls is unclear, this division is also a little difficult to understand.
Yeah, I think that will get clearer as I go. So what I'm most interested in there is actually public provision by sort of distinctly public institutions, rather than public financing of purchases in a market. But yeah, hopefully that will clarify a little bit. So that was Rawls on public provision. Somewhat inconclusive, but the general shape of the view hopefully is fairly clear. I now want to talk about kind of socialist or social democratic views about the purposes of public provision. And here, I can only apologise for, last time I was here I was talking about a Swedish theorist, I'm talking about a Danish theorist this time, so...
Sweden.
So I'll have to ask for Gustav's remark to be stricken from the record there. But I think, to my mind, one of the most interesting theorists of social democracy is Gustav Esping-Andersen. And what he says about the point of public provision is interestingly, strikingly different from the kind of approach that you see in liberal egalitarians like Rawls, but I think it's one, as we'll see, or as I'm going to suggest, that liberal egalitarians could learn from. So, on Esping-Andersen's view, in his book Politics Against Markets, the aims of public provision are much more complicated, really, than on a Rawlsian view. So, roughly speaking, these reasons are, one, about building social solidarity, especially across classes. So, the way people encounter each other within public institutions helps to build up the kind of bonds of solidarity between citizens that are then needed in order to stabilise those institutions. Secondly, an idea of the decommodification of labour, with an idea that what's expressed by that in terms of the standing and value of citizens is very important, so that certain forms of public provision, and I guess with the first one, I mean, in terms of Professor Rothstein's distinction there, that point about building solidarity, it might be especially significant that those are fully public institutions. The point about decommodification, I guess that could be either way. That could more be just sort of state financing or with regard to direct public provision. And only after those two is the more familiar category of distributive concerns, right? Thinking about public, tax-funded public provision as a way to reduce inequality, or to realise something like the difference principle, or whatever kind of distributive aim you might have. So liberal egalitarians are very focused on those purely distributive outcomes of the provision of particular kinds of public goods or services through public provision, and perhaps less focused, less attuned to some of those issues about building solidarity, or about the significance of decommodification. So here's what Esping-Andersen has to say about this idea of social solidarity. So he says, in the abstract, solidarity is negatively as well as positively defined. It demands a set of duties and responsibilities towards the community as a whole. That is, a readiness to sacrifice personal gain for the common interest. It also grants the individual a set of rights and expectations from the community. The sorts of solidarity required for social democratic formation demands decommodification, but this alone is not sufficient. So there's a link in his mind between these two aims of public provision. Now, what I'm going to suggest is that you start to see an echo here of the Rawlsian idea of the way we encounter public institutions helps to build the sense of justice. So that's in a way one of the kind of central ideas that I want to push here. But my hypothesis really is that theorists on the left have thought more about the real institutional preconditions for building something like the Rawlsian sense of justice, especially from a non-ideal starting point, than has Rawls himself or other liberal egalitarians. So that idea in Esping-Andersen of social democratic formation, the thought that actually it's not that you just have a citizen body with an independently existing set of preferences, but rather it's through the process of participation in a set of institutions that people's political outlook and their sense of their relation towards their fellow citizens actually comes to be more fully defined. So that idea of decommodification here, I think, is very important. On the social democratic view, decommodification protects the ability of individual citizens or workers to have periods outside the labour market without excessive losses. So in his other famous book, Esping-Andersen talks about the outstanding criterion for social rights being the degree to which they permit people to make their living standards independent of pure market forces. So in one way, that's very significant in terms of its pre-distributive consequences. So if you're, and we were talking before the start of the seminar about UBI. One of the arguments that people like Carl Wiederquist puts for UBI is that the existence of a universal basic income, by providing a degree of decommodification, by making people less reliant on their labour market income, increases their bargaining power at work. It changes their power against their boss at work or whoever it might be. So Wiederquist talks about the power to say no, but similarly, social democratic decommodification through the provision of a range of basic goods and services would have a similar kind of function. Better outside options would make workers stronger in negotiation, less vulnerable, and so on. So there's a kind of indirect distributive route there whereby decommodification creates a change in the power structure within the work relation, which then will lead to knock-on effects in terms of distributive outcomes. And I talk about that kind of effect a little bit in my paper on power, pre-distribution and social justice. Now, UBI would also go some way towards the decommodification of labour, but it does so in a much more individualised way, right? So that's meant to be the salient difference here, that you can have a kind of decommodification that connects with that idea of solidarity and building a sense of justice, or you can have the more individualised form of this that you see with UBI. The social democratic Esping-Andersen approach of creating a social wage forged by public provision of services aligns more with the creation and development of, in his terms, social solidarity. In the direction I want to put this, the sense of justice. What's expressed by those institutions is more collaborative and social in nature. So, it seems to me there's a significance to our sense of what we achieve together, embodied in our shared institutions, as opposed to simply having private protections from market outcomes. So if we're thinking about two routes towards decommodification, I think there are these additional benefits towards the more kind of social democratic route. So UBI here, I think, stands in strong contrast with, for example, socialised healthcare provision through an institution like the NHS in Britain. So here's Here's this is like a kind of joke in Britain that sort of centrist liberals always talk about the 2012 opening ceremony of the Olympics as like the high point of 21st century Britain. It's all been declined since. But I even from their left have a similar affection for the 2012 the 2012 opening ceremony. I think it would be hard to imagine UBI in the same way being the subject of a large sort of pageant where a country showed itself to the world, right? The thought of actually a shared institution aligned towards the care of citizens seems much more powerful. It's a nice illustration of a collective institution as a focal point for political identity and the sense of justice. I don't know if that's from The Guardian or from where, but like the headline at the time, Americans baffled by left-wing tribute to free healthcare during opening ceremony, which I thought was a nice headline. Anyway, back to Esping-Andersen on solidarity and decommodification. So here's what he says about that relationship, and I think this gets at something really quite powerful. So the ultimate instrument, he says, of social democratic class formation is state policy. The creation of solidarity will depend on reformist accomplishments, but how? In order to legislate such a social democratic community into existence, reforms must institute a universalistic alternative to both individualism and corporatism. Also, resources and living conditions must be distributed in such a way as to cancel out status differentials. So, I mean, that's a very important relational egalitarian ideal that is, certainly there in the Rawlsian kind of comments on equality that in justice as fairness. So, our first precondition, as we have seen, is to decommodify wage earners and endow all individuals with income and welfare entitlements of such scope that even the marginally weakest or strongest worker will refrain from breaking the rules of solidarity. This requires collectivization of those areas of human welfare and need in which the weakest groups are most likely to remain underprivileged under conditions of market provision. It's of paramount importance for solidarity that entitlements and services be universal, generous and attractive. Otherwise, there will be incentives for the better off to seek private market solutions. So here I am in Stockholm, taking coals to Newcastle, ours to Athens, again, as last year, talking about Meidner. But, that idea, which obviously has been, to some degree under threat or in retreat, but that idea that there's a special power to universalistic provision in creating the conditions for its own support and in helping to kind of change the sort of orientation of citizens towards justice is absolutely central. And that's not, well, as I'm about to argue, that's not an idea that's alien to the Rawlsian tradition. It's just an idea that's underdeveloped in the Rawlsian tradition. So, in contrast to the rather austere economistic view that I sketched at the start in Rawls's explicit pronouncements on public versus private provision, I think there's scope for a more I think there's scope for an approach that's kind of more friendly to some of these social democratic ideas. So in this handsome book, still available from all good bookshops, there's a very good paper by my sadly late friend and colleague Waheed Hussain on the Rawlsian sense of justice. So Hussain's account of reciprocity in the sense of justice is presented there in that handsome and well-priced book in the context of his defence of a particular interpretation of Rawls's idea of a property-owning democracy. That is a form of egalitarian private property market economy with a broad dispersal of ownership of productive capital. So there, Hussain wants to defend what he calls a democratic corporatist property-owning democracy over a liberal market property-owning democracy. What does that mean? It basically means a Nordic version. It means a version of property-owning democracy with forms of co-determination, with strong unions, with a lot of kind of public, with a lot of engagement of workers in thinking about in having a kind of incorporation of deliberation within economic relations in a way that maybe a more Anglo-American North Atlantic model doesn't. So Hussain's democratic corporatist version of a property-owning democracy, his Nordic property-owning democracy, if you like, has a lot in common with the view he defends in his posthumously published book, Living with the Invisible Hand, on what he calls a form of intermediated market economy. But one thing that strikes me, having gone back to Hussain's earlier article, is whether there might actually be resources for the Rawlsian defence of what would be a much less market-based economic regime, either than the one that Rawls himself defends, or the one that Hussain defends, either there or in his later book, which is a very good book, which I'd recommend everyone to read who's interested in some of these issues. So the basic argument of Hussain's paper on nurturing the sense of justice is that a just social arrangement has to be stable for the right reasons. Stability for the right reasons requires that citizens internalise a shared sense of justice that will lead them to support and uphold just institutions over time. Just institutions should appeal to citizens as both rational and reasonable. Their affiliation to just institutions shouldn't be merely strategic. So that's a very kind of Rawlsian thought. On Hussain's view, participation in the kind of secondary associations involved in democratic corporatism allows citizens to develop that shared sense of justice in a way that you wouldn't if your economic relations were just more purely strategic. So that's the thought. I mean, I guess that's the thought that's, it's there in Mill, in his writings on forms of economic democracy, and it's there in Joshua Cohen as well, and in various other writers who've looked to defend forms of economic democracy. But I think it's worth noting that even on Hussain's view, Hussain does not actually think that really existing forms of intermediated market economy as exist under Rhinish or Nordic forms of co-determination actually manage to engage citizens sufficiently to meet that aim of generating a shared sense of justice. So it's kind of a bet on what a kind of enhanced version of those sorts of arrangements might be able to do. I won't read that quote there from him, but I think that skepticism about how much is actually achieved by those sorts of institutions or practices in reality raises the question of how different an economic regime would have to be to kind of meet this requirement of trying to nurture the sense of justice, how different that would be to actually existing forms of co-determination. So Hussain follows Rawls's account of the development of the sense of justice, according to which reciprocity, so that idea of reciprocity is absolutely central. It's the central engine of normative attachment. So on the Rawlsian story, from the hidden in part 3 of A Theory of Justice, the account of the sense of justice is that the sense of attachment and affiliation that develops in immediate context, such as the family, then moves on to secondary associations, and then on to what Rawls calls the morality of principles involved in affiliation with justice as such. So participation in forms of public deliberation, that participation in the political life of the community, on Hussain's view, allows us to ascend through these levels of development, the development of the sense of justice. But I'm unconvinced, I think, about whether that's a sufficiently complete story. I think we might have reason to accept the centrality of that idea of reciprocity in building the sense of justice, while being sceptical about the completeness of that story about the special role of participation or forms of economic democracy or forms of co-determination taken on its own, as opposed to an element in a broader system. So I mean, I'm here really to talk to colleagues about economic democracy, but this talk really is about why economic democracy isn't enough, and why there's also this role for the creation of certain sorts of public institutions. So compare with these claims made by Hussain. So Hussain, in his paper, where he talks about the preconditions for nurturing the Rawlsian sense of justice, says the focus of this argument has been on expanding the public sphere. So that's one claim. And secondly, on Rawls's view, society nurtures the sense of justice by putting people in a position where they can appreciate how the social order embodies a caring concern for their interests and the interests of people they care about. So there's two ideas there about, on Rawls's view, what are the preconditions for getting citizens to actually have the kind of sense of justice that you need in order to have a stable, just society. On the one hand, you need the sense that of an expansive public sphere, and secondly, that idea that that public institutions to which you contribute also kind of contribute towards the welfare of you and those that you care about. So Rawls talks about principles of moral psychology buried very deep in section 5 of a theory of justice. I won't read all of this out, but the second law is about sort of moving from immediate sort of family context or whatever towards thinking about social arrangements and social relationships within which individuals develop ties of friendly feeling and trust towards others in that association, as they with evident intention comply with their duties and obligations. So the thought is that there's a set of social relations that are generated by well-functioning institutions that then are a precondition for the stability of those institutions over time. And on the third law, given that, as Rawls puts it, given that a person's capacity for fellow feeling has been realised by his forming attachments in accordance with the first two laws, and given that society's institutions are just and publicly known by all to be just, then this person acquires the corresponding sense of justice as he recognises that he and those for whom he cares are the beneficiaries of these arrangements. So that emphasises the role of human relationships in building the sense of reciprocity and the sense of the value of, and then a commitment to, public institutions. So if you think they're about, examples like the experience of being cared for in a public health system or being provided with opportunities by a public education system. So what would it actually look like if you thought about, so back to the NHS and the Olympic opening ceremony, what would it look like to have a society that built a sense of justice? So these two thoughts, the idea of kind of care and concern and the idea of an expansive public sphere. I think there's materials then in Hussain's Rawlsian discussion of reciprocity and the sense of justice to carry us to a different kind of conclusion from his own or from Rawls's more market-based accounts of what kind of society would be needed to have to enact justice in a stable way. So there's that idea of care and concern for citizens and for those they care about. That suggests the need for a flourishing domain of non-market provision, healthcare, education, training, preschool provision, and so on. It suggests that an important way to build a sense of justice is not only to increase participation in corporatist institutions, as on Hussain's view, but also to situate people in secure relations of care and support from state institutions, public institutions. And secondly, that idea of expanding the public sphere suggests that there may be a need to increase engagement and participation in the shared life of citizens, not necessarily only in the economic sphere. Could include democratic subsidiarity, thinking about local democracy and so on, expansion of public space, improving democratic education in schools, reducing the voting age, whatever it might take to have the idea of a kind of more expansive realm of public deliberation. So the account of reciprocity there gives us reason to think that a stable, just society is one with an expansive and significant non-market sphere. It pushes us not only towards humanising the market from the inside, as on Hussain's view about democratic corporatism, but towards limiting the scope and significance of market exchange within society, which brings us back to the socialists and social democrats. So my hypothesis is, in talking about the role of the sense of justice, the Rawlsian approach assumes the existence, under ideal circumstances, of the very thing that politics has to conjure into being. Right? So Rawls, because it's an exercise in ideal theory, the whole account of the development of the sense of justice that he thinks is a precondition for having a just society depends on the existence of just institutions in which those sorts of attitudes develop, right? It depends on his view, standing in these sorts of interpersonal relations that are mediated by just institutions. But if you don't start with those institutions, it looks like that account doesn't tell you very much, or it gets into trouble very quickly because there's no account there of how that's called into being. By contrast, the social democratic or democratic socialist approach gives more of a kind of bootstrapping solution, right? So Esping-Andersen is talking the whole time of kind of like building the forms of solidarity necessary for the stable bedding in of just institutions. A political account of how a political community with a strong sense of justice can be created and maintained. So it has the advantage of starting from the non-ideal, with the idea that successful forms of public institution building are a way of creating the requisite kind of sense of justice. But also with regard to ongoing stability, decentering the market and shrinking its range will allow for a more secure ongoing realization of a community with a robust sense of justice, for those very reasons about the focus both on care and concern and the idea of an expansive public sphere. So, what would a more expansive Rawlsian public realm look like? So, in a recent paper that Gustav mentioned at the start, I've got some discussion of the way that Rawls gets misled by that kind of excessively orthodox conception of public goods, and a suggestion that we need a kind of broader conception here of how a different attitude towards the border between public and private provision could be thought about within kind of liberal egalitarianism. So Rawls's presentation of the case for public goods, going back to the standard definitions in terms of indivisibility and non-excludability, excludes many forms of public provision that we might want to argue for on grounds of social justice, and which people often do argue for. Public provision of higher education, libraries, museums, galleries, and so on. We need to address these kinds of public institutions in turn and not fall back on the formal point, as Rawls seems to do, about whether they count as public goods in the technical sense. We need instead to think about the preconditions for stability and what kinds of public institutions will build the sense of reciprocity that's needed. So I think that I was struck really by rereading Ralph Miliband's final book on how Miliband's approach to thinking about the transition to a more socialist set of arrangements, or the stability of those arrangements, highlight exactly those same issues about stabilizing a set of social relations that then are the precondition for people having an orientation towards a more just set of arrangements, being prepared to contribute towards them and to maintain them, as being part of the problem that we ought to think about when we think about the demands of justice, not just thinking about distributive principles in the abstract, but thinking about the kinds of social institutions that would be needed to build them and to stabilize them. So this Rawlsian route to decommodification and social provision via Rawls's account of the sense of justice, I think brings one towards a kind of radical social democratic or democratic socialist position that has a lot in common with the views of more avowedly socialist authors like Miliband.
5 minutes.
Yep. So I'm very near the end. So Miliband says here, a social order in which basic needs are no longer subject to ability to pay would create conditions in which a sense of community diffused through the whole of society would be encouraged to flower and would enrich both individuals and social life. In short, he says later, a socialised economy, to reiterate a fundamental theme of this book, would free the whole of society from the fetters imposed by the rationality of capitalism and substitute for it an altogether different rationality, attentive to human needs and seeking their satisfaction under the least onerous conditions possible. So again, going back to the idea of, it's kind of attentive, the thought that there are public institutions attentive to the needs of citizens and being the sites where those relations of sort of reliance and then of reciprocity get built. The view there in Miliband is sort of interestingly similar to Rawls's in terms of the thought that reducing the scope and size of the market sector and having kind of forms of decommodification that stand as a kind of precondition for a kind of social precondition for developing these relations of reciprocity and then for stabilizing the sense of justice, you end up with a view that's sort of interestingly similar. So despite my age, I tried to make a meme. So I've managed that. Which suggests that anyway, that's self-explanatory. So that's where I am. Right, final slide. So democratic socialist platforms in recent years. So if you think about Bernie Sanders or the kind of Corbyn manifestos in the UK, have argued for decommodification and public provision outside the market of quite a range of goods and services. From obviously healthcare, which is already subject to that kind of public provision, but also social care, post-compulsory education and training, public housing, childcare, or even broadband. An approach grounded in a Rawlsian understanding of social justice has, hopefully I've shown, the resources to assess these kinds of democratic socialist claims and to endorse them. But first, I think we need to liberate the theory from the artificial limitations it places on itself through that rather orthodox approach to public goods and its vision of the role of the state as merely residual in a market economy. So a hunch is that we can get a long way if you start from the opposite side. If you start with the idea of thinking about the collective institutions we need, and that we need not only because of particular kinds of distributive outcomes that they can enact, but because of the sorts of social relations that they can make possible and then stabilize. And then think of the residual role of the market after that, right? If we reverse the order of investigation, I think that might be quite a fruitful way of thinking about what the institutional requirements of a just society might actually be like in a way that's kind of maybe less constrained by current arrangements. And my claim is that a broadly Rawlsian approach is consistent with a view on which we move towards socialism by progressively limiting the scope of the market. And that view is, to answer the question Gustav asked right at the start, that view is really the opposite of market socialism as normally understood. So, thank you very much indeed for listening. I realised that was covering more ground than I realised. And I shall stop, so thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Just repeat what we do in this question and answer. We have both online people and we have people here. And you online, you should write your question in the chat and also write your area of study, since we like to mix questions from different disciplines. And here we have just put up your hand for a question and a finger if there's a follow-up. And unusually, because of some trouble at Stockholm University, I will directly give the first question to Professor Rothstein, since he has to leave, unfortunately. Here.
Thank you, Martin. This was very illuminating. Having lived for 2 years in the UK, I'm a big fan of the NHS. But to my surprise, many of my leftist friends there were not so positive as I was. I had no serious illnesses. For the small thing, it actually worked much better than our system. But 2 questions. First, there is a critique, and maybe you should look at against the decommodification thesis. It's by a sociologist in Umeå, Staffan Marklund, who pointed out that in order to be decommodificated, do you say that in Sweden? You first have to be commodificated, meaning that we have a large group who never, and this group is, I think, increasing, who never was able to get stable employment in the first place. So they didn't get all those social insurances, healthcare they got, but many of the social insurances didn't apply to them, like unemployment insurance or sickness insurance, for example. Pensions, yeah. Secondly, in the late 1980s, we had a gigantic power and democracy study in Sweden. And I was a small part of it. And one thing that this gigantic research project did was to send out a survey about how Swedes perceive their power and influence and how they were treated in 6 areas. It was the labor market, the housing market, the market for, what do you say, washing machines, commodity market, consumer goods, yeah. The healthcare system, the daycare system, and the educational system. And it was a very high quality questionnaire, and it really shocked the left and the Social Democratic Party, because it was very clear that the Swedish citizens felt that they had much less influence, much less power, were much less thought of as fellow citizens in the 3 sectors that were then completely in the public realm: daycare, education, and healthcare. And this, I think, was one of the reasons that we got this, in my view, ill-regulated privatization of these systems. So there is, I think, a little problem here with this thesis that it will create this friendly feeling if you have a completely public system, because this system, because of all the problems of implementation that most people in political philosophy do not care about, there will be a kind of a black hole in the democracy. What actually happens in the emergency room or in the classroom or in the caretaking of elderly, in the micro level, there is very little democracy there. It's a kind of, and these things can, for, if your mother is not well treated in the elderly care, if your kids are bullied in the classroom and you cannot do anything about it. This creates a real problem for democracy, I think, because there is I call it a black hole in the system that we have to think about. Thank you.
Fantastic. No, those are great questions. It's great to hear that you had a positive experience of the NHS, because I think the common sort of British view, especially on the left, I suppose, is to be completely in love with the idea, or the sort of abstract model, but to think that the reality is just absolutely appalling. And
the statistics are fantastic. What you get for your money.
Well, yeah. Well, no. The value for money is extraordinary, but the disappearing levels of funding, obviously, are another issue. So, okay. So on kind of decommodification and sort of, I suppose, kind of insider outsider problems. I think that's exactly right, and there's a huge problem if these sorts of benefits that could then the sort of institutional benefits that citizens might get, and which could then stand behind these relations of reciprocity and support for the system, only go to one group and not to the other. I mean, I think interestingly there, within the even within the kind of broader Rawlsian approach, there are quite good resources for dealing with that, where, as I mentioned early on in the talk, there's that shift in Rawls's view towards thinking not only that he was in favour of the state as employer of last resort, but that any reasonable conception of justice has to be committed to that as well. And that idea as well, I guess, is there in Tony Atkinson's last book on inequality, what can be done, or I forget the exact name of it. So I guess I think you're absolutely right that that's a problem where those insider-outsider effects exist, and I suppose under actually existing regimes that do okay at, to some degree, looking after parts of the working population, that's a huge problem. And I think then thinking about what a more just economic settlement might look like would have to take that very seriously, and then thinking on the employment side and what the state's role is in terms of regulating unemployment. But there, especially the kind of Rawls or Atkinson suggestions on the state's particular role as being an employer of last resort maybe gives a response to that. On power and democracy. So I absolutely don't come here to sort of. It would be extraordinarily eccentric of me to give a talk wanting to sweep away economic democracy as part of the solution to this problem. And I'm certainly not doing that. I guess what I'm just worried about is the Waheed Hussain's view, which emphasises participation, democratic deliberation within the economic sphere. I guess he doesn't have much to say there actually about the public sector or about power in the public sector. All I want to do is say that account is plausible, but it's not the whole story, and that you've got to then think about these other elements. But I think something maybe for all of us to think more about is what economic democracy means when you think about not only private sector relations but also about public sector relations, and how economic democracy relates to that project of having a kind of a broader and more active and more participatory public sphere. I mean, interesting to hear that people in Sweden felt they had so little power, even in things like kind of local childcare provision. I think, one of the best things that the Blair and Brown governments did in the UK was to introduce Sure Start centres, which, as you know, were these kind of local community daycare centres, which I think tended to function really well in having a lot of community participation, being quite sort of democratic spaces that really kind of brought people in and did the kind of building of the kind of participatory practices that then lead to kind of support for the institutions. Of course, that was one of the things that have really withered in the UK over the last, whatever it is, 13 years. But I think, we've seen, even in the British case, what a version of that kind of institution, think about daycare and childcare, what a version of that institution would look like that actually functions pretty well and does well in terms of participation and engagement and that sense of distributing kind of power, as well as just thinking about kind of distributive outcomes. So.
Wait. And you're not allowed to ask this if you stay for my follow-up question.
Yeah. When this survey was done, there was no possibility for parents to, if they were not happy with one daycare center, to choose another public. Right. It was a kind of arrested situation. Yeah. Okay, I have to run.
Hold on for 1 second. You can make it. I got a follow-up question for you. For this, I want you to listen to. So one thing I wondered about, there was a lacuna in your talk. I didn't see you mention anything about the sense of justice and that is fostered in workers' cooperatives and worker-owned companies. And that seems, I mean, if the few students I know about that, it's actually they have a much more egalitarian ethos, a more kind of cooperative ethos. So in your criticism of market socialism, I find it's kind of a bit surprising that you didn't mention that.
I'd refer you to O'Neill, 2008, 3 Rawlsian routes towards economic democracy. So I was taking that as read, Gustav. I was just sort of wanting to. I should have said something about that, but I guess I was thinking about what else we should be doing, but absolutely thinking that the role of worker-owned firms, cooperatives in creating.
Then you might have less needs for what else you need to do if that is fostering that kind of sense anyway.
Well, I mean, that's only ever going to be, under anything close to current conditions, you might think that's a really important part of the, economy that it would be good to develop further, but that's only ever going to be a sector of the economy. So you might think that those sorts of institutions are very important and indeed play exactly that role, as John Stuart Mill thought they could, or Joshua Cohen has written about this as well. But one might still think that that more needs to be done in other areas. Okay,
I'll get back to that. I didn't understand that part of this part of the economy. So you couldn't have a mixed economy that just consists of either state-owned or regional-owned or locally owned companies, and the other ones are all worker-run or worker cooperatives. Why couldn't you have any mixed economy like that?
You could, I guess. I suppose there's questions about what the public sector looks like under those sorts of conditions. I suppose what I'm thinking about in terms of the framing of this talk is more about possible regimes that are, if not directly adjacent, then not so far distant from kind of familiar kinds of mixed economy.
So I misunderstand. So you basically, this is just how you could make a kind of classical mixed economy better, and you haven't taken into account what would happen if you replaced the ordinary capitalist firms with employee-owned firms.
Well, it would be a much bigger jump, and I guess.
I just trying to understand. Okay, but then I see because I think it really raises a question how much you're going to need of this if you would have that companies were mainly owned either by, state or local or by employees. Then it would be a question how much of this is relevant.
I mean, as I say, I think there's very strong reasons to think that it would be good to increase the size of the cooperative sector. Quite what the kind of other implications might be after one got beyond a certain level, I'd need to think more about.
All right. Okay, so then we have, let's see, I have a list here. Yeah, Zach.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. So one long-standing worry about public provision within egalitarian theories is that how much even if you formally have access to these goods and services, how much you actually benefit from them will be heavily dependent on your socio-economic status, right? So it's known that middle-class people get more out of the NHS because they feel more comfortable with middle-class doctors and are able to ask more questions. If there are national parks provided, you may need a car to kind of benefit from those to actually get there, right? So first of all, I wonder if there's any sort of recognition of this in the sort of left-wing thinkers you're thinking about. And then sort of a more substantive question is, what is this a worry? Is this a trade-off we just have to live with, right? We have, the sense of justice we're trying to foster on the one hand, distributive justice, the difference principle, whatever, on the other hand. And it might be actually a more troubling trade-off than we might think, since if people see certain groups in society getting more out of these goods and services, that might itself undermine trust, might undermine the sense of justice. So, I'm curious about what you think about that.
I think that's a wonderful question, and I think the answer is that it's the phenomenon that you point to there. It's really interestingly double-edged, because in one way, that the fact that often, let's say, antecedently more advantaged people, more middle-class people, are going to benefit more from universal services than are those who are more disadvantaged. In one way, that's part of the very mechanism that people like Esping-Andersen are interested in terms of transitioning towards a more just society. That very fact helps you to get buy-in from people who are more politically powerful, whose voices get listened to more. Helps you to get buy-in from those people to help then support and develop institutions that are going to be to the benefit of everyone, even if it's still going to be the case that there's differential benefit between the more and less advantaged. I guess what's really significant then is to think about whether there is any. So I guess that there'd be a trade-off if one thought that there's some other kind of way, let's say, some other better way of improving, let's say, the educational prospects of the least well-off, or the health prospects of the least well-off, or whatever it might be. Is there some other plausible kind of institutional route where you could improve their position that didn't involve the creation of these sorts of universal institutions that in the first instance are more directly beneficial to the middle class? Now, it might, I mean, I don't know the answer to that, but I think the answer might be that there isn't, right? It might actually be that these sorts of broad-based public institutions that pull in the support of everyone actually might be the best way of aiding those who are less advantaged, even given this fact about the differential benefit. So there might be a kind of sort of almost a kind of difference principle type thought there that might stand behind them. I suppose the other part of the answer is to say that within this thought about expansive public provision, where you're thinking about, for example, lifelong retraining opportunities, or you're thinking about a well-funded set of public institutions devoted to providing educational opportunities for people. I mean, the overall structure that's sort of being justified here should be one that the tendency will be towards reducing class inequalities. So I guess that there's a thought about whether, I mean, again, I suppose that this sort of bootstrapping thought that seems to be there in Esping-Andersen, the thought that one could almost like make use of a current inequality of power in order to kind of bootstrap support for an institution, which then, as it operated over time, might reduce those inequalities. But I think it's a great question, and I think notwithstanding those difficulties, it probably I don't think it undermines the case for these sorts of institutions, but I think it's a very important point, and one that I'll hope to think a bit more about. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Ned Hurcock from Swedish Institute for European Policy Studies. We'll come to Europe in a minute, but I first want to say, is it right to say there's like two camps in your talk? First camp who emphasize the sense of community that's necessary for building a kind of more just society or making any change, and then a camp who's interested in the sense of community that proceeds from that. So what the picture will look like afterwards. I was thinking about that Rawlsian Miliband. And then the first camp reminds me of Jeremy Corbyn, as a kind of unfair picture of Jeremy Corbyn who loves hanging around in a community cafe in North London. And I think that's very nice too, but I also think like nothing follows at a national or international level from the fact that there are these community cafes. There is a kind of local solidarity, and because I used to live in Hackney where they have a kind of thriving community, while London and the UK was still experiencing real problems. But my real question is about the national community or international community, European, about kind of identity. How much does any of this, for these thinkers, depend on membership of a national community or citizenship of a particular state? I think that's relevant when it comes to the EU in terms of the EU being a kind of market integrator, internationalization of regulation without internationalizing social protection, and then also when it comes to dealing with global heating and global inequality. How much is, if we want to do that and we want people to be on board with that, how much does that depend on? Will there be a sense of community, between Swedes and people in Swaziland, Eswatini?
Could I just get you to do your description of the two camps again? At the
Yeah,
start?
so it seemed to me that you're talking about, sorry, I spoke very fast, people who emphasize, who are sort of describing the conditions which will or might allow for a more just society, depending on a sense of community. So reciprocity. I find it deeply unconvincing, right? That's the basis on which welfare states or just societies work, is that I believe that someone else will reciprocate. Because it depends on analysis of motive and so on. I found it unconvincing, but I think there was some of that in the first half of your talk. And then afterwards, Rawlsian Miliband at the end was talking about, well, after we've kind of instantiated or created a more just society, then there will be a new social order will produce a greater sense of community. And I'm also not even like that interested in whether it will or not. There's probably some empirical work. But that was just to get to the point about national communities as a kind of prior or, a kind of prior condition. Does that make sense?
Yeah, good. So I don't really think that's those aren't really two camps in the sort of arrangement of views sort of under discussion there. It's more the contrast between the kind of views that want to think carefully about so take one step back. I think either on the kind of Rawlsian picture or on the kind of Miliband picture, it's not that, or on the Esping-Andersen picture, it's not that there's this kind of resource of solidarity that is or isn't there, and then that's a precondition for having the institutions. And nor is it that you can somehow magic the institutions into play and then there's a social transformation. It's rather that there's this constant feedback mechanism the whole way through. So the opposing parties, in a way, are just between those on the left, or even Rawls in the sense of justice bit rather than the kind of talking about public goods bit. Those who try and think quite carefully about those feedback mechanisms and how they should factor into our thinking, as opposed to a kind of, let's say, principles-based liberal egalitarianism that just is a bit incurious about those sorts of social relations or those sorts of institutional mechanisms. I was just writing a different thing, responding to a paper by Joseph Heath, who was defending various forms of privatisation, and I was trying to think about how plausible that reciprocity account is, right? That idea of actually kind of the way you can kind of be knocked sideways almost by the kind of the sort of the benefit that you get from certain kinds of public institutions, even if the benefit you get from certain kinds of social institutions, where that happens within a completely sort of non-market relationship. And so on the NHS, I get brought back to the birth of my twins, right? It was so they had to be delivered by cesarean section. It was twins. There were so many people in the room, right? So my wife had to wait around for quite a long time. You know, there was some problems with people being kind of called away to emergencies and stuff. But once it happened, there was like the full attention of, like, I don't know, there was like 10, 15, 12, 14 people in that room, highly skilled, just completely sort of focused on the care and well-being of my children and their mum. And the thought that, like, you know, there's no money changing hands here. This is like this completely non-commercial relationship with these people that you've never met, and suddenly, like, there's this sort of just extraordinary level of care and this sort of, I mean, there's something there that, or, you know, or again, if you think about the kind of the dedication of, like, of you know, your kids' teachers or whatever, and you think, this is amazing. These people that I had no connection to are suddenly, like, devoted to like the life and well-being and development of. Anyway, sorry, this is just. So I don't think that reciprocity idea is that implausible, right? Because I think that, you know, there is a sense in which, even if you're, you know, if you're sort of fortunate enough to be, as it were, you know, a net contributor rather than recipient or whatever, you know, the sheer sort of the sheer power of certain sorts of interactions that you have, where you derive particular kinds of benefits from participation in public institutions, is remarkable. Anyway, setting all that aside, the point about sort of national identity and so on, it's a shame that Bo Rothstein's gone, because I think I'm just completely convinced by Bo's view in Just Institutions Matter, right? So where his account there says, well, look, the reason that, you know, if you take the Swedish case or whatever, it's not that there's this sort of antecedent. I mean, and I realise there's been a lot of shifting away from the high tide of Swedish kind of the Swedish welfare state and Swedish social democracy. But on Bo's view, it's not that you have a kind of antecedent, particularly strong national identity that then is the precondition for having certain sorts of institutions. It's rather, if you've got successful, efficient, universalistic institutions, that they bootstrap this kind of the conditions for their own support over time. So I take it that Bo's view in Just Institutions Matter, which is, you know, I guess a, you know, much more empirical book, you know, fits well with the kind of Esping-Andersen account in Politics and Markets, or with the kind of reconstructed sort of Rawlsian view that I'm sort of trying to develop in the paper. So so on those views, national identity per se doesn't really matter. It's more about participation in the institutions, creating the conditions for its own support. On the international front there, I guess I'm a bit reminded of something Thomas Nagel says in The Problem of Global Justice, which is that it's almost like you'd need the institutions first to kind of build the, you know, if only that, you know, there was some sort of you know, really successful global institutions that could get sort of buy-in on the same terms, then you'd hope to kind of create that sort of affiliation. So I think one good thing about the, if you like, the kind of Rothstein Esping-Andersen view is that it doesn't, I mean, it leaves you with the huge problem of thinking that you'd need, first of all, to have, you know, at least the glimmering of successful institutions in order to build the affiliation. But what it saves you from is the thought of being stuck where you think, oh no, my goodness, we haven't yet got that sense of a shared community, and therefore we can never have the institutions. So, sorry, that's a very long answer.
Yeah, long finger, long answer. Next is Göran Dus Otterström online. He will appear, I hope.
Here I am. Can you see me and hear me?
Yes, very well.
Good, thanks. So I'm a political scientist, political theorist. I thought this was really interesting. I have a question which follows up. I guess you kind of answered it, but it follows up on the exchange about national community. And so I thought that, Rawls had famously little to say about immigration. And I was wondering whether there are any implications of your view for immigration policy. If we take the non-ideal starting point in which we find ourselves, then I think that the left is kind of all over the place when it comes to immigration policy. And my impression is that one threat to the, how do we get there? These solidaristic institutions seems to be that there's quite widespread anti-immigration sentiments in the population, which may undermine support for public provision. So I was wondering whether you can, as a terribly broad question or a comment, I'm asking you to sort of offer some thoughts about what the implications are for the kind of immigration policy a society which aspires to be just should follow.
Yeah, so I'm not sure that I've got anything particularly distinctive to say on that front, really. I mean, thinking about my own favoured example of the one I know best in a way of the British National Health Service. That, of course, is completely dependent on immigrant labour in order to function. It's very, it's hard to imagine. That's not a recent phenomenon either. I mean, my mum came over in the 50s from Ireland to be, to train as an NHS nurse. So those very kinds of public institutions, both on the being involved as sort of working in those institutions and being sort of beneficiaries and contributors to them, I think are just very important for integration. And it's very difficult to think about, how immigration can sort of function well without those sorts of shared public institutions where people encounter one another, and where those kind of egalitarian social relations that you might get, from being all parents of the kids at the same daycare or at the same school or whatever it might be. So, I mean, I don't know how it is in Sweden, really, but I mean, I think certainly anti-immigrant sentiment in Britain is often sort of whipped up by political forces that are only too happy to underfund public institutions and then to look to sort of displace the blame for that on, often on immigrant populations who are much more likely to be net contributors rather than, or to work even in those institutions rather than sort of being a drain on their resources. So I don't know. I'd have to think more about it, but I think if you think about the kind of building of social relations that's going to be necessary for like the full incorporation of immigrant communities into a kind of into the public sphere and their full kind of participation within the host society, then I think the kinds of public institutions that I'm sort of arguing for here are going to be very important in that process. But yeah, I'd have to think a bit more about exactly what that argument looks like.
Happy with that,
Great.
Karen?
Oh yeah, thanks.
Well, so on that note, join me in thank Martin for this very good, a sensible talk I was going to say, but a very good talk.
Thank you for the really good questions. Thanks very much.
And I'm going to mention there are some talks coming up. There's going to be more political science here. We have Chiara Cordelli going to speak about capitalism beyond domination. Bo Rawlstein, our own Bo Rawlstein here. The shadow of the Swedish right. And then the last seminar will be on the 13th of December. The first one was 6th of December. The second one 13th of December. And then actually, unusually, so that's why I mentioned on 13th of December, apart from Bo Rawlstein's talk, which starts very unusually at 9 o'clock. I don't know what that reason is, but I read it here. Because then we also have a seminar at 3 o'clock with Marko Zuka, who's going to speak about determinism and the value and fairness of lotteries. So you're all very welcome.